In the unforgiving heart of 1871, Texas, where the land was etched with sorrow and blood, Eliza Jane Thompson's life was a quiet testament to solitude. A widow at 24, with only the wind and the ghosts of memory for company, she believed her story had already been written. But one stormy night, a future she never dared to imagine washed up at her door, bleeding and hunted. This isn't just a tale of survival against the odds. It is the harrowing, true account of how one woman's single act of compassion, hiding a fugitive Comanche warrior, would ignite a firestorm of danger devotion and a love that would defy a warring world. The dust of West Texas was a living thing. It coated the tongue, settled in the soul, and over the past 3 years had become Eliza Jane Thompson's most constant companion. Her small homestead, a stubborn clapboard cabin, and a sturdy barn was a lonely island in a sea of grama grass and prickly pear miles from the nearest neighbor, and a full day's ride from the fledgling town of Redemption Creek. The land was a legacy from her late husband Samuel, a man she'd loved with the fierce, simple purity of youth. He had promised her a dynasty built on longhorn cattle and the black gold rumored to sleep beneath the soil. Instead, the Civil War had claimed him, leaving her with nothing but a folded flag, a Colt peacemaker he'd taught her to shoot, and 160 acres of unforgiving earth. At 24, Eliza was a creature of routine and resilience. Her hands, once soft enough for needlepoint, were now calloused from mending fences, drawing water, and working a small garden that was her defiant splash of green against the endless brown. The folks in Redemption Creek, the few who spoke to her, called her the widow of Whisperin' Ridge. They saw her as a tragic figure, a ghost haunting her own life, too stubborn or too broken to sell her land and return to whatever civilized place she'd come from. They didn't understand that this land, this silence, was all she had left of Samuel. To leave it would be to bury him a second time. The storm came on a Tuesday in late October. It wasn't the usual dry thunder that rattled the windows. This was a furious wet tempest born in the Gulf and driven inland with a vengeance. Rain fell in solid, blinding sheets, turning her dusty yard into a churning river of mud. The wind shrieked like a banshee, testing every nail and plank of her small cabin. Eliza sat by her stone hearth, the firelight dancing across the pages of a worn Bible, the Colt resting on the mantelpiece, within easy reach. In this land, a storm wasn't the only danger the night could bring. It was a flash of lightning, brighter than 100 suns, that revealed him. For a split second, the entire prairie was illuminated in stark, ghostly detail. And there, by the cottonwood tree that marked the path to her spring, was a figure. He was slumped against the trunk, half collapsed, a shape that did not belong. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. Her first thought was a raiding party separated in the storm. She snatched the heavy Colt from the mantel, its weight a familiar comfort. She crept to the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass. Another flash. The figure was still there, unmoving. He looked alone, wounded. Every instinct screamed at her to bar the door and wait for morning. This was Comanche territory, the dreaded Comancheria. Men like Quanah Parker and his Quahadi warriors were legends whispered in hushed, fearful tones. A lone woman had no business inviting trouble, especially trouble of that nature. Samuel's voice echoed in her memory, a low, urgent warning from their first days on the homestead. "Liza, if you ever see a warrior, don't hesitate. Don't think, just shoot." But the storm raged, and another image fought against Samuel's warning, the image of a man, any man dying alone in the cold mud. She thought of Samuel, lying wounded on some forgotten battlefield in Georgia, with no one to offer him a sip of water or a gentle hand. The thought was a physical pain. Cursing her own foolishness, she pulled on her oilskin coat, grabbed a lantern, and chambered around in the colt. The wind tore the door from her grasp. As she stepped outside, the rain instantly soaking her. Holding the lantern high, she sloshed through the mud toward the cottonwood tree. He was Comanche. There was no mistaking the high cheekbones, the long black hair plastered to his face, or the faint remnants of ochre and black paint washed away by the rain. He was young, perhaps her own age, and built with the lean, powerful grace of a predator. But he was grievously injured. A dark, ugly stain spread across his buckskin leggings from a wound high on his thigh, and his left shoulder was mangled, the bone clearly shattered. He was barely conscious, his eyes fluttering open to reveal dark, fathomless depths filled with pain and defiance. His hand was still clenched around the hilt of a hunting knife. He saw her, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. He tried to raise the knife, a last desperate act of a cornered wolf. I'm not going to hurt you," Eliza said, her voice swallowed by the wind. It was a stupid thing to say to a man who likely didn't understand a word of English and saw her as his mortal enemy. She held the lantern closer. The leg wound was bad, a deep gash that looked like it came from a bowie knife, but it was the shoulder that was killing him. It was a bullet wound, torn and festering. He was burning with fever. She could feel the heat radiating from him, even through the cold rain. He wouldn't last the night out here. At that moment, a choice was made. It wasn't born of logic or reason, but from a deep, aching well of empathy she thought had long run dry. She would not let another man die alone on her land. She set the lantern down, keeping the colt firmly in her right hand. "You let me help you," she said, speaking slowly, as if to a frightened horse, "or you die right here. It's your choice." His dark eyes held hers. He seemed to understand not her words but her intent. The fight in him, the fierce warrior's pride, was at war with the simple, desperate need to live. Slowly, painfully, the tension in his arm eased, and the knife handle slipped from his grasp, falling with a soft thud into the mud. It was a surrender. It was an act of trust, and it was the beginning of everything. Dragging him to the cabin was a Herculean task. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. Twice she slipped and fell in the slick mud, his groan of pain a visceral thing that tore through the storm's howl. Finally, gasping for breath and soaked to the bone, she got him inside and onto the bearskin rug in front of the fire. She barred the door, her mind racing. What had she done? She had brought the very danger she'd been warned against into the heart of her home. Lying on her floor was a man who, under any other circumstance, would likely have killed her without a second thought. Yet looking at him now, shivering and pale beneath his bronze skin, she saw not a savage, but a person in agony. First the wound. She stoked the fire, put a kettle on to boil, and gathered her supplies, carbolic acid, clean rags, and the small surgical kit Dr. Aris Thorne from Redemption Creek had given her years ago. She cut away the blood-caked buckskin from his leg. The gash was deep and inflamed, but clean. She washed it with boiled water and a harsh lye soap that made him hiss in pain, then dressed it tightly with a clean linen bandage. The shoulder was far worse. The bullet was still in there, lodged against bone. She had seen Samuel's father, a country doctor, perform such an operation once. It was a bloody, brutal business. She knew if she didn't get it out, the infection would kill him. She poured a generous measure of whiskey into a tin cup. He watched her, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "For the pain," she said, holding it out. He stared at the cup, then at her, and finally took it. He downed the liquor in one go, hissing as it burned its way down. She offered him a strip of leather. "Bite on this." He shook his head, a small, proud gesture. He would not show such weakness. Her hands trembled as she probed the wound with the sterilized forceps. Sweat beaded on her forehead. He was rigid, his entire body a knot of controlled agony, but he did not make a sound. The only sign of his suffering was the tightening of his jaw and the fierce, burning concentration in his eyes, which never left her face. It felt as if he were measuring her soul. After what felt like an eternity, her forceps scraped against metal. With a final agonizing twist, she pulled the mangled lead slug free. He let out a sharp, shuddering breath, his body finally going slack. He was unconscious. For the next 3 days, Eliza was a prisoner in her own home, tethered to the life of the stranger on her floor. The storm passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and a sky of impossible blue. But she didn't dare venture out save for quick trips to the well. She kept her shutters closed. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant coyote howl sent a jolt of fear through her. The warrior drifted in and out of a fevered delirium. He cried out in a language that was all harsh consonants and soft vowels, a river of sound she couldn't comprehend. In his fevered dreams, he was fighting hunting and riding. She sponged his burning skin with cool water-forced sips of willow bark tea between his cracked lips and changed his dressings. Slowly the fever broke. On the 4th day, she awoke to find him watching her from the floor. His eyes were clear, lucid, and full of a quiet, unnerving intensity. There was no gratitude in them, not yet. There was only appraisal. They existed in a world of silence, their communication a careful ballet of gesture and observation. She would leave a bowl of broth for him, and when she returned it would be empty. He would watch her as she went about her daily chores, kneading bread, mending a shirt, cleaning her rifle. She learned the cadence of his breathing, the subtle shifts in his expression. She saw the intelligence in his eyes, the pride in the straight line of his back, even when he was sitting the warrior's economy of motion in every small movement. One afternoon, a week after his arrival, the sound of hoofbeats sent a surge of pure terror through her. It was Sheriff Brody and his deputy Miller. Sheriff Jed Brody was a man whose ambition had long outgrown the small town of Redemption Creek. He had a politician's smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He'd made no secret of his belief that Eliza's land, with its year-round spring, was wasted on a lone widow. Afternoon, Mrs. Thompson Brody called out, his voice oily and smooth. "Just making our rounds. Heard the storm was a bad one out this way." Eliza stepped onto the porch, her body a rigid barrier in front of the door. She held a shotgun loosely in her hands, a tool for rabbit hunting she'd made sure to grab. We managed Sheriff. Strong cabin. Brody's eyes swept over her property, lingering on the barn, the well, the house. "Good to hear. There's been some trouble. A small Comanche war party was cut off by a cavalry patrol up near the Brazos. Most were killed, but we have reason to believe 1 or 2 might have scattered south. Wounded, most likely. You see anything?" Out of the ordinary, the lie came easily born of a protective instinct she didn't know she possessed. "Nothing but rain and mud, Sheriff. The coyotes have been bold, that's all." Deputy Miller, a lanky man with a perpetually mean-spirited squint, spat a stream of tobacco juice near her steps. "You ought to be careful out here all alone, ma'am. An injured brave is more dangerous than a cornered rattlesnake." "I'm always careful," Deputy Eliza said, her voice flat. Brody's smile widened. "Of course you are. Still, this land is no place for a lady on her own. My offer still stands. A fair price for the deed. You could be back east somewhere safe before the first snow. This is my home." She said the words like stones. I'm not selling. Brody's gaze hardened for a fraction of a second before the smile returned. Suit yourself. We'll keep your eyes peeled. There's a bounty on any hostile. $50. A lot of money for a poor widow. He tipped his hat and they rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a thick sense of dread in their wake. When Eliza went back inside, her hands were shaking. The Comanche warrior had pulled himself up. He was leaning against the wall, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife, which she had cleaned and returned to him. He had heard everything. He looked from her to the door, and then his dark eyes met hers again. For the first time, she saw something other than pain or suspicion in them. It was a flicker of understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the risk she was taking. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't thanks, it was respect, and in the dangerous silence of that cabin, it was more than enough. The days that followed Brody's visit settled into a new, strange rhythm. The warrior was healing. The gash on his leg was closing, and while his shoulder remained a source of pain, he was regaining his strength. He began to move around the cabin, his steps as silent as a cat's. He would sit for hours watching the world through the small window, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, as if he could will his people to appear. They started to talk, not with a shared language, but with a patchwork of signs, gestures, and single words. He pointed to himself and said a word that sounded like Tavibo. Son. He pointed to the sky, then back to himself. Tavibo. She pointed to herself. Eliza. He tried the name, his tongue, struggling with the unfamiliar sounds. Eliza. It came out soft, a whisper. He taught her his words for water, fire, and horse. She taught him the English words. He was a quick study, his mind sharp and observant. He learned the names of the objects in her home, touching the rough-hewn table and saying, table with a quiet reverence, as if learning the spirit of the thing itself. A bond grew between them, forged in shared silence and mutual dependency. He saw her strength, the quiet determination with which she ran her homestead. He watched her chop wood, her movements efficient and strong, and saw the weariness in her shoulders at the end of the day. One morning, she came out to find he had taken the dull blade of her axe and was sharpening it to a razor's edge with a flat stone from the hearth. It was a small gesture, but it was an offer of partnership. She in turn saw the man beneath the warrior. She saw the gentleness in his hands as he carved a piece of scrap wood into a tiny, perfect horse for her mantelpiece. She saw the deep sorrow that flickered in his eyes when he looked to the north, a raw expression of longing for his people. He was not the bloodthirsty savage of the stories. He was a man proud and intelligent, stripped of his world and utterly alone. Her feelings for him were a confusing tangle of fear, compassion, and a burgeoning admiration that felt dangerously like affection. He was nothing like Samuel, who had been full of laughter and easy words. Tavibo was a man of profound silences, his emotions conveyed in the subtle shift of his eyes or the set of his jaw. Yet in his presence, the crushing loneliness that had defined her existence began to recede. The cabin felt less empty, the silence less profound. One day, necessity forced her into Redemption Creek for supplies. She left Tavibo with a plate of cold biscuits, her shotgun, and a warning look. He simply nodded, understanding the danger. The town felt different, charged with a nervous energy. In the general store, the proprietor, Silas Croft, a notorious gossip, lowered his voice as he bagged her flour and salt. You heard about George Hennessy's boy, he murmured, his eyes wide. Found him 2 days ago, arrow in his back. Must have been that Comanche the sheriff is hunting. Eliza's blood ran cold. They're sure it was the fugitive Brody's, sure Croft said. Formed a posse. They're combing the hills between here and Larno. Brody's offering a bonus out of his own pocket. Says he wants that savage's scalp himself. He was in here yesterday, buying up every box of 44 cartridges I had. A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. Brody wasn't just enforcing the law. This was personal. It was a crusade. Her fears were confirmed on her way out of town. Hidden behind the livery stable, she overheard two men talking, their voices low. One was Deputy Miller. "Don't see why Brody's so obsessed with this one Indian," the first man said. Miller spat. "It ain't about the Indian, you fool. It's about the widow's land. Brody's been trying to get his hands on that spring for years. He figures if he can prove she's harboring the Comanche, or even just scare her enough, he can get the land for pennies on the dollar. The dead Hennessy boy is the perfect excuse to put the fear of God into her. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. It wasn't just a bounty hunt. It was a trap, and she was the prey. Brody didn't want to find Tavibo in the hills. He wanted to find him at her homestead. The murder of the Hennessy boy, if Tavibo hadn't done it, and she felt a fierce, certain conviction that he hadn't, was a convenient pretext. Brody was manufacturing a crisis to steal her home. She rode back to the cabin at a gallop, her mind a whirlwind of terror and fury. She had to get Tavibo away, not just for his safety, but for hers. She burst into the cabin, her face pale. He was on his feet, instantly sensing her panic. "Brody," she said the name like a curse. "He knows. He's coming." She didn't know how to explain the rest, the complex web of greed and deceit. She didn't have to. He understood. He walked to the door and looked out, his gaze sweeping the landscape. He was a warrior. He knew the scent of a closing trap. He looked at his still healing shoulder, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. He was not yet strong enough to run, not fast enough to fight a whole posse. That night they sat in the dark, the fire unlit. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage. Every sound from the prairie, the wind a snapping twig, was the sound of approaching doom. Eliza sat in her rocking chair, the shotgun across her lap. Tavibo stood by the window, a silent, motionless shadow, his knife in his hand. They were trapped, a lone woman and a wounded warrior waiting for a war to come to their door. The fragile trust they had built was about to be tested by fire. The next 2 days were a torment of waiting. The air was thick with unspoken fear. They ate little, slept less. Tavibo's recovery seemed to accelerate, driven by sheer force of will. He began testing his shoulder, performing slow, deliberate exercises that made him grit his teeth in pain. He was reclaiming his body, preparing for a fight he knew was inevitable. Eliza watched him, her heart a painful knot in her chest. She had brought this upon him. Her foolish act of mercy had led him from a quick death in a storm to a slower, more certain one at the hands of Brody's posse. And in doing so, she had likely signed her own death warrant. On the third night, he spoke. The moon was a silver sliver, casting long shadows across the floor. I believe he said the 2 words, clear and final. "You're not strong enough," she protested, her voice a hoarse whisper. "They'll hunt you down. They come here," he countered, his gaze intense. "You die." He tapped his chest. "I die. Here. No chance. I run. I have a chance." He was right. Staying was suicide for them both. If he was found here, Brody would have all the justification he needed. He would be a hero for killing the savage, and she would be branded a traitor, her life and land forfeit. If Tavibo ran, he at least had a warrior's chance in the wilderness, he knew. She, however, would be left to face Brody's wrath alone. A plan began to form, desperate and fraught with peril. "They'll be watching the north," she said, thinking aloud. "They expect you to go back to your people. You must go south. Follow the Llano River downstream. There are canyons, caves. You can hide hunt. Get your strength back." He listened, his head tilted, processing her words. He understood the strategy. They prepared in silence. She packed a small oilskin pouch for him, a strip of dried beef, a small tin of matches, and a block of salt. She also took down Samuel's old compass from the mantel. Her husband had treasured it. She pressed it into Tavibo's hand. "So you don't get lost," she whispered, her fingers brushing his. His skin was warm, his hand strong and calloused. A jolt, potent and unexpected, shot through her. He looked at the compass, then at her. He reached up and untied a small leather thong from around his neck. On it was a single perfectly formed eagle feather, its base wrapped in intricate quill work. It was a sacred object. She knew a piece of his identity. He held it out to her. "For Eliza," he said, his voice soft. "Brave. Numi Teb." He touched his heart. "My friend." Tears pricked her eyes as she took the feather. Her fingers trembled. In his world, this was a gift of immense significance. It was a piece of himself. The time for his departure came just before dawn, in the deep grey stillness, when the night hunters were retiring, and the day was not yet born. It was the hour of ghosts and shadows, the best time to slip away unnoticed. He stood before her at the door, no longer a patient, but a warrior. He was dressed in the mended buckskins, his knife at his belt, his long hair tied back. He was gaunt and still favored his shoulder, but the fire was back in his eyes. "They will come for you," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "I can handle Sheriff Brody," she lied, trying to sound braver than she felt. He looked at her, his gaze searching her face in the dim light. He saw the lie, and he saw the fear she was trying so desperately to hide. He reached out his movements, slow and gently touched her cheek. His touch was not rough, as she might have expected, but surprisingly tender. It was a gesture of profound intimacy, more eloquent than 1,000 words. "I will come back," he said, his voice a low, solemn vow. "For this?" He lightly touched the eagle feather she now wore around her neck. He was not just promising to return, he was promising to return for her. Before she could process the depth of his words, before she could answer, he turned and slipped out the door, disappearing into the pre-dawn gloom, as silently as he had arrived. Eliza stood at the open door, the cool air raising goosebumps on her arms. She watched the spot where he had vanished, listening. There was no sound, no snapped twigs, no rustle of leaves. He was gone. The cabin was suddenly terribly empty again. The loneliness that descended was heavier and more absolute than anything she had ever felt before, even after Samuel's death. She clutched the eagle feather at her throat. It was the only proof that he had ever been there, that the past few weeks had not been some fever dream born of solitude. "I will come back." It was a mad, impossible promise. He was one man wounded against a hostile world. The odds of his survival were minuscule. The odds of him ever finding his way back to this specific, lonely cabin were even smaller. But as the first pale light of dawn began to erase the stars, Eliza clung to that promise like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. It was all she had left. She closed the door, slid the heavy bar into place, and picked up her shotgun. Now her own wait began. Tavibo's absence left a void in the cabin that was both physical and spiritual. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with dread. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats, every shadow a lurking threat. Eliza forced herself into a state of hypervigilance, her shotgun or Samuel's Colt never far from her hand. She ate standing by the window, slept in short, fitful bursts in the rocking chair, her ears straining for any sound. 3 days after Tavibo's departure, Brody arrived. He didn't come alone. He brought Miller and 4 other men, a grim-faced posse who looked like they'd been promised blood. "Mrs. Thompson." Brody called from a safe distance, his voice devoid of its usual false charm. It was cold and hard as iron. "We have reliable information that the Comanche fugitive, the one who murdered the Hennessy boy, has been hiding on your property." Eliza stepped onto her porch, the shotgun held at her side, its twin barrels pointing at the ground. "Your information is wrong, Sheriff. I told you I've seen nothing. We're going to have to search your property," Brody declared, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "The cabin, the barn, everything." "You don't have a warrant," she stated, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. Brody laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "A warrant. Out here, Mum, we're a long way from the courtesies of Austin. We're hunting a killer. Now you can step aside, or I can add obstruct injustice to the charges." "What charges?" she challenged, raising her chin. "Harboring a fugitive, aiding and abetting a known hostile, treason against the good people of Texas. Take your pick." He spurred his horse forward, stopping just at the edge of her small, struggling garden. "Last chance, Mrs. Thompson. Let us search, and maybe we'll believe you didn't know he was here." She knew it was a lie. If she let them in, they would find some fabricated piece of evidence, a moccasin, print, a stray bead, and that would be the end of her. Her only chance was defiance. "This is my home," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't feel. "Get off my land." Brody's face contorted into a mask of pure fury. This was not going according to his plan. The lone broken widow was supposed to be an easy target. "You've made a grave mistake," he snarled. He turned to his men. "She's in there with him, I'm sure of it. We'll starve them out." Thus began the siege. Brody and his men made a rough camp just beyond rifle range, near the line of mesquite trees that bordered her property. They were a constant, menacing presence. They made no move to attack the cabin directly. Brody was a coward at heart and had no desire to walk into a shotgun blast, but their intent was clear. They were cutting her off, waiting for her to run out of water food or nerves. The first day they tried intimidation. They rode around the property shouting threats and obscenities. Miller, with a cruel laugh, took aim and shot one of her 2 chickens, its squawk cut short in a puff of feathers. The act was meant to terrorize her, to show her their power and her helplessness. It only hardened her resolve. By the second day she was rationing her water. Her well was outside 100 feet from the cabin, a suicide run. She had 2 full buckets inside, enough for a few days, if she was careful. The summer heat was relentless, turning the cabin into an oven. The psychological toll was immense. The isolation was absolute. She was a castaway on a desert island, surrounded by sharks. At night they lit a large bonfire, its light flickering menacingly, their drunken laughter and jeers carrying on the wind. They were trying to break her spirit, to grind her down with fear and exhaustion. She thought of Tavibo. She prayed he had made it, that he was safe in some hidden canyon growing stronger. She clutched the eagle feather, its soft edge, a comfort against her skin. "Be brave," she told herself. "Be the woman he thought you were." On the morning of the 4th day, Brody changed his tactics. He had realized she was more stubborn than he'd anticipated. Just after sunrise, she watched in horror as Deputy Miller and another man rowed to her well. With a wicked grin, Miller emptied the contents of a canvas sack into the water. Poison, likely lye or something worse, meant to foul the water and drive her out by thirst. Rage, pure and undiluted, supplanted her fear. They had shot her livestock, threatened her life. and now they were destroying the very heart of her land, the water that gave it life. This was Samuel's well. He had dug it with his own 2 hands. That was the final violation. She rested the barrel of her shotgun on the windowsill, took careful aim at the wooden bucket sitting on the well's edge, and squeezed the trigger. The blast echoed across the prairie, and the bucket exploded into a shower of splinters. Miller and his companion, yelping in surprise, scrambled for cover. It was a declaration of war. She wasn't just hiding anymore. She was fighting back. But she knew it was a futile gesture. Her bravado had only bought her a little time. Her water was nearly gone. The food wouldn't last forever. Brody and his men could wait for weeks. Sooner or later she would have to surrender or die of thirst. That evening, as the sun set, casting a blood-red glow over the landscape, despair began to creep in. She sat in the deepening gloom of the cabin, the heavy Colt in her lap. She had one last choice, to make a swift end by her own hand or a slow, agonizing one at theirs. The promise Tavibo had made seemed like a distant, foolish dream. He wasn't coming back. How could he? Brody and his men were growing bolder. Emboldened by her silence, since the shotgun blast they were moving closer. She could hear them making plans, their voices clear in the still evening air. They were talking about fire, about burning her out. She checked the rounds in the Colt. 6 shots. Maybe she could take 1 or 2 of them with her. It was a bleak and lonely end to a life that had once been so full of promise. She closed her eyes, and a single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It was a tear not of fear, but of profound sorrow for the love she had lost, and for the new strange love she had found, only to have it torn away. The smell of smoke, a lit torch, began to drift on the breeze. The end was here. The first torch arced through the twilight, a fiery comet that landed on the dry roof of the barn. The old weathered timber caught instantly. Flames licked upwards, painting the sky in hellish hues of orange and red. The crackle of the fire was punctuated by the triumphant whoops of Brody's men. Eliza watched from the window, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. The barn was more than just a building. It was where she and Samuel had sheltered their first calf, where they had danced to a phantom fiddle on their wedding night. It was a repository of memories, and now it was turning to ash. "That's right, you witch!" Brody's voice bellowed across the yard. "Your whole worthless life is going up in smoke. Come on out, or the cabin's next." Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She looked around the small room, the rough-hewn table, the rocking chair, Samuel's Bible on the mantel. This was her sanctuary, her fortress. The thought of it consumed by flames was unbearable. She raised the Colt, her hand steady now, a strange calm settling over her. She would not let them burn her alive. She would meet them on her own terms, on her own 2 feet. She took a deep breath, ready to unbar the door and face her end. And then she heard it. It was not a sound she recognized at first. It was a low, rhythmic drumming that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was the sound of dozens of unshod ponies ridden hard over the prairie grass. Brody and his men heard it too. Their jeers died in their throats, replaced by a confused silence. Eliza squinted, peering into the gathering dusk towards the northern ridge. At first there was nothing. Then they appeared. They crested the ridge not as a scattered group, but as a single, terrifying entity. Silhouetted against the last of the sun's dying light were no less than 50 riders. They were a vision from a settler's nightmare. Warriors stripped to the breechcloth, their bodies gleaming with war paint, their hair adorned with feathers that fluttered in the wind. They held lances, bows, and rifles, and they moved with a fluid, disciplined grace that spoke of countless battles. Brody and his posse were frozen, paralyzed by a combination of shock and primal fear. This wasn't a lone, wounded fugitive. This was a war party. This was the wrath of the people. At their head rode two figures. One was an older man, his face a mask of stern authority, a magnificent eagle-feather war bonnet flowing down his back. He radiated a power that was absolute, but it was the warrior beside him that made Eliza's breath catch in her throat. He rode a proud paint stallion, his body lean and strong. The fevered, wounded man she had nursed was gone. In his place was a warrior in his full glory. His face was painted in stark lines of black and white. His shoulder, though still bearing a wicked scar, was strong enough to hold a Winchester rifle with ease. It was Tavibo. He had kept his promise. The warriors fanned out, forming a silent, deadly crescent that trapped Brody and his men between them and the burning barn. The posse who had been so bold against a single woman now seemed to shrink, their faces pale with terror. Deputy Miller dropped his torch, his hands trembling as he fumbled for his pistol. The old chief raised a hand, and the entire war party came to a halt. The only sounds were the crackling of the flames and the nervous stamping of the horses. Then Tavibo urged his horse forward, walking it slowly until he was just yards from the cowering sheriff. His eyes, burning with a cold fire, met Brody's. "Sheriff," Tavibo said. His English was clear, precise, learned from days and nights of listening in Eliza's cabin. He had practiced, she realized, for this very moment. Brody stammered, his bravado utterly shattered. We were hunting a murderer. He killed a boy." Tavibo's gaze was like chips of obsidian. The boy with the arrow in his back, that arrow was Sioux, from a hunting party 200 miles north. Your posse did not find him. My scouts did. They also found the tracks of one man leading away from the body. A white man, wearing boots like yours. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. You killed that boy, to have an excuse to take this land. The accusation, delivered with such cold certainty, struck the posse like a physical blow. Their eyes darted from Tavibo to a suddenly sweating Brody. The foundation of their self-righteous crusade had crumbled into dust. "That's a lie," Brody blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. Tavibo ignored him. His gaze shifted, moving past the sheriff, and found Eliza, who was now standing ghost-like in the doorway of her cabin. The cold fire in his eyes softened, replaced by a look of such profound emotion that it made her heart ache. He had not just come back. He had brought the thunder of his people with him. He had come to move a mountain for her. He dismounted his movements, fluid and confident. He handed the reins of his horse to another warrior and began to walk towards her. Unarmed, his hands open at his sides, he walked through the terrified posse as if they weren't even there. Brody Miller and the others could have shot him in the back a dozen times, but they were too terrified to move, pinned by the collective gaze of 50 Comanche warriors. He stopped a few feet from her porch. The fire from the burning barn illuminated the scene, casting flickering light on his painted face and her pale, tear-streaked one. The world seemed to shrink until it contained only the two of them. "Eliza," he said, his voice soft for her alone. "I told you I would come back." The standoff was absolute. Behind Tavibo, the formidable presence of the Comanche war party was a silent, unassailable wall. Before him, Sheriff Brody and his men were caught, their greed and cruelty exposed under the unforgiving Texas sky. The old war chief, whom Eliza would later learn, was Nocona Tavibo's father, and a legend among the bands of the Llano Estacado, spoke a sharp command in his native tongue. Two warriors dismounted, and with terrifying efficiency disarmed Brody and a whimpering Deputy Miller. They did not resist. Their fight was over. Nokona nudged his horse forward, his piercing eyes scrutinizing first the cowering lawman, then the small defiant cabin, and finally Eliza herself. He looked at her, not with hostility, but with a deep, searching curiosity. He saw the shotgun she still held, the weariness in her frame, and the unyielding strength in her eyes. He said something to Tavibo, a low question. Tavibo answered in Comanche, his voice ringing with conviction. He gestured to Eliza, then to his own scarred shoulder, then to the poisoned well. He was telling the story. He was telling them everything. As he spoke, the expressions on the faces of the warriors shifted from stony impassivity to a grudging respect for the white woman in the doorway. They understood courage, and they understood honor. This woman possessed both. When Tavibo finished, Nokona looked at Brody with utter contempt. He spoke again, and Tavibo translated his voice, now cold and hard for all to hear. My father Nokona, chief of the Antelope Eaters, says the law of the white man is a snake. It bites the innocent and spares the guilty. You, he fixed his gaze on Brody, are not a man of law. You are a thief and a murderer. You are not worthy of a warrior's death. He turned to the rest of the posse. Leave. Tell your people what happened here. Tell them that the people protect their own. Tell them this land, he swept his arm to encompass Eliza's entire homestead, is under our watch. It is Pia Kaku sacred ground. Anyone who sets foot here with malice will answer to our lances. Now go. Scrambling over each other in their haste, the 3 remaining posse members mounted their horses and fled into the darkness as if the devil himself were on their heels. Nokona gave another order. The 2 warriors holding Brody and Miller shoved them forward. You will walk back to your town, Tavibo commanded. You will have no guns, no water. The prairie will pass its own judgment upon you. With a final terrified glance at the silent ranks of warriors, Brody and Miller stumbled off into the night, their fate now left to the harsh justice of the land they had tried to steal. The immediate threat was gone. The barn still burned a funeral pyre for Eliza's past, but the air was no longer thick with menace. It was filled with a powerful electric tension of a different kind. Tavibo walked up the steps to the porch and stood before Eliza. He was so close now she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, the fine lines of exhaustion around them. He reached out and gently took the heavy shotgun from her hands, setting it aside. Then his hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs stroking away the tear tracks on her cheeks. You fought them, he said, his voice a murmur of awe and reverence. Alone. Numitabe, my brave friend. You came back, she whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't dare to hope. My life is yours, he said, simply, as if stating the most obvious fact in the world. You gave it back to me in this house. It belongs to you now. He turned to face his father and his warriors. He raised his voice, speaking in the loud, formal cadence of a public declaration. He spoke for a long time, his words echoing in the night. Though Eliza did not understand the language, she understood his tone. It was a speech of honor, of debt of a bond, forged in secret and now declared before the world. When he finished, a murmur of assent went through the assembled warriors. Tavibo turned back to her, his eyes blazing with an emotion so fierce it took her breath away. I have told them of your honor. I have told them that you saved the life of a son of Nokona. This is a debt that our people will never forget. I have also told them that I will not leave you again. He took her hand, his strong fingers lacing through hers. He led her down the steps of the porch and onto the dusty ground, into the center of the crescent of warriors. They were now encircled by his world. He stood before her, tall and proud, and looked into her eyes. In my tribe, he said, his voice thick with emotion, When a man chooses his wife, he brings her before his family and declares her Nimia, my wife. He vows to hunt for her, to fight for her, to place her safety and happiness above his own. He dropped to one knee, a gesture she did not expect, a strange and moving blend of his world and hers. He held her hand to his heart. I cannot give you a house in a town or a life of soft hands. I can give you the sky as your roof and the plains as your garden. I can give you the loyalty of my heart and the strength of my arm. I can give you a place among my people, a place of honor. Eliza Jane Thompson. He said her full name, a sound of reverence on his lips. Be my wife, before my father, before my brothers, before the spirits of this land. Become Nimia. The world stood still. The burning barn, the silent warriors, the vast star-dusted sky. It all faded away until there was only the man kneeling before her, offering her a life she could never have imagined. A life of danger, of hardship, yes, but also a life of fierce, unwavering love and profound belonging. She was no longer the lonely widow of Whispering Ridge. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, of hope, of a love that had been born in a tempest and forged in a siege. Yes, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Yes, Tavibo, I will. A great wild cheer erupted from the 50 Comanche warriors. It was a sound of victory, of celebration, of acceptance. Nokona, the great war chief, smiled, a rare and powerful sight. In the heart of a hostile Texas, under the light of a Comanche moon, a bridge was built, not of wood or stone, but of courage and love. A fugitive warrior had returned for the widow who saved him, and before them all, he had made her his own. The story of Eliza and Tavibo is a powerful testament to the human spirit, a reminder that in the harshest of lands, courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. Their union, witnessed by warriors under the vast Texas sky, wasn't just a marriage. It was a bridge built between two worlds, a defiant act of hope, proving that family can be forged in the most unlikely of alliances, and love can be the most formidable weapon against hatred and greed. They chose not to be defined by the world's enmity, but to create a new world of their own. If their incredible journey from a storm-swept cabin to a life among the Comanche has moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this story with someone who loves epic tales of the Old West, and most importantly, please subscribe and ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter from the annals of history. What part of their story resonated with you the most? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for listening.